Hello friends, Dr. Joel Hunter here to discuss your week of Introduction of Ethics, and this week the subject is moral nihilism. And this is the second chapter in our part in the text, the third part of the text that is devoted to meta-ethics. And so this follows on our chapter 19 discussion of ethical relativism. And one of the commonalities between ethical relativism, or at least the way I presented it, and today's presentation on nihilism is the concept of expressionism. So we'll see how your author puts expressivism as a form of moral nihilism. And then the other form of nihilism that we'll talk about is called error theory. We'll actually do that first. Let me see if there was any kind of housekeeping issues to deal with. Let me just sort of give you a big picture overview of where we're going to go in this video. So nihilism is a term that means meaninglessness. So nihil, N-I-H-I-L, is a negative. So it's a form of saying not or nothing. And so when you see nihil in a word, you know you're encountering you're encountering whatever the thing is being denied or being negated or being being equated with nothing. So, for example, nihilism as a metaphysical position, as a form of saying something about reality, then is a denial that there's anything real, or that it can be known. But we're going to talk about moral nihilism. So moral nihilism is denying the objectivity of ethics. It says that not just that ethical claims are relative or that they're a matter of personal opinion or cultural norms, but that they positively do not exist. Moral norms, okay? So it is then a more radical option than ethical relativism because it denies that there are any moral standards or moral facts at all. Nihilists claim there's a sharp distinction, in fact, between the world of facts and the world of values, and that although facts really exist, values do not. Okay, so I've mentioned that it comes in two forms, at least that's how your author categorizes them. Error theory, certainly a form of moral nihilism. Expressivism, also a form of moral nihilism that has more features in common with relativism, but we'll see that they are not actually compatible in today's video. According to error theory, there are no moral features in the world. And because our moral judgments are attempts to describe moral features in the world, these judgments are always false. Error theorists claim that all moral views are based on a single mistaken assumption that there are objective moral standards that give us reasons for action regardless of our desires. Those are called categorical reasons, by the way. When we talk about Kant later in the semester, you will encounter this idea of a categorical imperative, so a duty that applies regardless of any sort of external motivation for doing it, or any sort of reward or punishment for doing it. It is simply an intrinsic duty that one has, a categorical imperative. So a categorical reason is similar in that it is a reason that applies to your actions or behavior regardless of whether acting on the principle will get you what you want. Okay? So, back to error theorists, they deny that there are such things as categorical reasons. Okay. So some have argued, and your author will talk about this, although I'm not going to cover it in any detail, that the error theory is wrong because if it were to be accepted on any kind of wide scale, then that would be a disaster. Okay, so that shifts the argument from whether or not it's true to whether or not it's beneficial, a prudential argument, in other words. And so your author raises that as one common response. I would say it's not a very philosophical response. It's more of an intuitive response. Just because you don't like the results of a theory or a claim does not mean that it has anything to do with whether it's true or not. So, yeah, we're talking about getting to the truth of the matter. And what we want to know is whether moral nihilism is true or not, in error theory in particular, whether that theory is true. And so the idea that, what does he call it? He calls it the argument from disastrous results. So it's on page 311. So that's one kind of response, and your author shows why that's probably mistaken to take that tack. So what we need to know is whether error theory is true and what that depends on. So we know at least two things, and we'll talk about this when we get to it, but just summary, whether morality really does essentially involve the assumptions that it's based on objective moral standards, and whether it provides us with categorical reasons for action. That's assumption one. And assumption two is whether those assumptions are true. Okay, so we need to know whether error theory depends on those assumptions or not. Okay, so the second type of moral nihilism is expressivism, and they agree with moral nihilism in that there are no moral features in the world, and thus there are no moral claims that can be true. Boy, I'm having a hard time with C's and T's today. According to expressivism, however, moral judgments are not attempts to make claims about moral features of things, okay, but instead express our attitudes, our feelings, our emotions about those features or those possible courses of action, for example. So when we're making a moral judgment, say about torture, we're not saying anything about the world according to anything real about the world, not some sort of objective feature of the world, according to the expressivist. Instead, we're expressing something about our emotions. We'll talk about that a bit more. So what they're doing is they're shifting moral arguments and denying that there's any sort of factual claim at all in making a moral judgment. So they're trying to deny that there are any moral facts, but they don't want to simply say that our moral judgments are simply an error, right? That there's anything sort of functionally wrong with our reasoning. Expressivism also manages to avoid some of the challenges facing relativism and subjectivism, but it does have problems because it has a hard time explaining the possibility of moral argument. It denies that moral claims can be true. And then the theory does not allow for the possibility of amoralists. So those are folks who make moral judgments but are not motivated by them. So we'll look at that as well. And it is not clear how expressivists would even understand what people are saying when they make some more, not necessarily complicated, because a lot of them are actually rather common things, common moral claims people make. But they're not the kind of claims that fit into what expressivists say we're doing when we make moral judgments. So we'll look at a couple examples there. Okay, so with that said, as sort of the overview of where we're going to go, let's dig in now to our slides and talk about the specifics. So let's talk about moral nihilism. Again, the Latin word nihil means nothing, so it is a denial. And so the denial is that there are moral truths. And it is grounded in a principle, or I should say moral nihilists are insistent on a principle about a sharp dichotomy between facts and values. So facts apply to states of affairs, to things external to any observer, that can be true, or be evaluated as true by using the tools of the senses. So, the things that we would typically take as being subject to evidence, by what do I want to say here about? How do I put it? I want to avoid the word science if I can, and I'm having a hard time doing that because I think I'll tell you what. I'll just give you some scientific facts, and then you can see what I mean by the world. So if you want to know the contents of the world, the factual content of the world, if you want to know the states of affairs in the world, what you would want to do, the only things that could be measured as true or false in such statements of fact would be things like, a sphere is of this mathematical description. Okay, can't even remember what it is. The volume of the sphere. So, volume of the sphere has a particular mathematical formula, right? Organic life on the Earth is carbon-based. This pencil is 6 inches long. Okay, so that's the kind of thing. What do we need to verify that claim? Well, we just need a functional visual system and some sort of measurement canon by which to units of length to determine that. So mathematical claims mathematical claims are a little different because they would involve, they go beyond things like what is accessible to the physical senses. They have to do with things that are abstract and only accessible to the mind. So the volume of a perfect sphere is an example of that. There are no physical perfect spheres. Other examples would be logical laws, law of non-contradiction. So how can we verify that law? Well, we can't do it with the means of scientific investigation. There, I went and did it. I said science. Oh well. Anyway, you get the picture. So, the nihilists will want to separate the world neatly between the world of facts, and there we can use the concept of truth, and the world of values, and there we cannot use the concept of truth. Okay, so values value claims, I should say, cannot be factual, therefore they can't be true. Okay, so that's the fact-value distinction, really crucial to understand that. So let me see. Yeah, it's kind of important to catch this because what the nihilist is saying is that a value claim, like torture is wrong, is not just mistaken or open for debate. They're saying that claim describes nothing. Okay, so there is nothing in the world that actually describes. It's not, now don't get me wrong, they're not saying that torture doesn't exist. They're saying that the value behind the claim of torture is immoral or torture is wrong, they're saying that moral fact does not exist. Okay? All right, so let's move into the two types, and we have error theory up first, and then we'll talk about expressivism, really kind of revisiting expressivism. Error theory sounds scary. It sounds like something, maybe in computer science, but it's not. This is at least not in its philosophical form. There may be a form of error theory in computer science, for all I know. So let's look at the claims that the error theorist affirms here. So there are no moral features in the world. So nothing is morally good or bad. There is nothing that is right or wrong. There is nothing that is virtuous or vicious. So you can, tally up everything in the world and you will not come across any moral features whatsoever. you will only come across the kinds of things that I mentioned earlier. There are, the second claim then is that no moral judgments are true. So the reason for that follows from the first claim here, and that is, if there are no moral features in the world, there is no truth bearer for our moral claims, and therefore a moral judgment cannot be true because there is nothing to make it true. There is nothing. There's nothing that is being intended or described in the world objectively when we make a moral judgment. So it can't be true because there is nothing for them to be true of. Okay. Let's see if there's anything else about that. I guess not. Right. Third claim then is our sincere moral judgments try and always fail to describe the moral features of things. So this then is this is the error part of error theory. And so because the first two claims are true, that when we then do make moral judgments, we are making a mental error. Essentially, we are making a judgment based on nothing. Let's see if I can state that a little better. Okay, let's put it this way. So when we make a sincere moral judgment, we think that we're trying to say something true about the world, like that torture is immoral. But the problem is when we make that, we are basing it on the false assumption that there are moral truths like that torture is immoral. So if there's no moral truth, then that judgment is mistaken. Okay? And that's the error. So then the fourth claim follows from these, and that is that there is no moral knowledge. Knowledge requires truth, and so if moral claims are not truths, then there's no such thing as moral knowledge. That's simple. Okay? So it's important to recognize how radical the claim is, and radical means sort of getting at the very bottom of everything. Radical means getting to the root. And this claim, if true, is then sort of uproots all of morality, all of our moral thinking. So your author goes into an analogy between error theory. Error theory is to morality as atheism is to religion. And I think that's kind of helpful. And I think it would be true to say that that all is that true? No. I was going to say you can actually combine them a little closer, but I don't think you can. Not all error theorists would be atheists, is that right? Not all atheists would be error theorists, I think is the correct way to put it. Because some atheists might be expressivists, for example, or might be subjectivists, or might be cultural relativists, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be fair to say. So there's a relationship between the two, but that's not important. What's more interesting is the analogy. So yeah, we want to know, though, about this belief in categorical reasons. And again, this is a term that we'll see in Kant when we read him, or read about him, I should say, is that is to understand what a categorical reason is, and that is a reason that applies to us regardless of whether acting on them gets us what we want. So, for example, you shouldn't lie. Let's do that. Take that as a moral duty. Okay. So, if there is a categorical reason for the principle of not to lie, then that categorical reason means it is a right-making feature of not lying, regardless of whether you agree with it or not, whether it suits you or not, whether it makes you happy or not, whether you desire it or not. It's saying something that would be an objective standard for morality. Okay, I hope that's clear. So, if this assumption under the idea of objective morality is mistaken, then the problems raised by the relativists or by the nihilists is a serious problem indeed. And of course it can be challenged. So you'll be looking at and trying to understand categorical reasons. That's, by the way, that term, I've bolded it here on the slide because it is one of those glossary terms that you need to make sure that you know. So I want you to know that, and be sure you look carefully at the definition in the text. Use the glossary in the text as well if you need to. Let me back up and just make sure that I haven't missed one. No, we talked about fact-value distinction. That's in there as well, and moral nihilism itself, of course, is one of those glossary terms. So error theory denies the truth of all ethical claims. So it's not actually an ethical theory. And this is why it belongs in metaethics, by the way. It is instead a metaphysical theory. So it's saying something about the nature of reality. So it belongs in that subset of philosophical questions like, is there a God? Is there a non-physical mind? Is there a soul? Do we have free will? Are we immortal? Those kinds of questions. The moral nihilist is making a kind of claim that belongs in that category of questions. Okay? So it's interesting to note that that position itself is not itself testable by the criteria that they invoke for the fact-value distinction. Set that aside. But the self-referential problem or self-obviating problem is probably a serious objection. I don't think your author addresses that. Okay, so let's look at. Actually, do I want to say anything about? I mentioned that there's an argument from disastrous results. I'll let you look at that on page 310 to 312. Not a particularly strong argument because it is essentially an ad hominem argument, and not one that is philosophically serious. And so what we have to do is you have to get at the root issues themselves. So if you're going to answer the error theorist, then you have to look at what those specific objections are that they make, and that is that morality is objective, okay, and that it supplies us with reasons to obey whatever those moral standards are, regardless of our desires, the categorical reasons, right? So that is where the challenge lies. Now, you can say, well, wait a second, are we really committed to those positions if we adhere to objective morals? The idea that there are moral facts in the world, that there are objective moral standards. Good question. Certainly, the subjectivist does not have to agree with the error theorist on that. The cultural relativist doesn't need to agree with the error theorist on that. So they can deny the existence of any error since they reject the thought of objective moral standards as well. So they're sort of off the hook. So what we need to know then is that move that the error theorist makes from the claim that there are no moral facts in the world to our moral judgments. Let me just go back to the slide. That therefore that the no moral judgments are true. That then our sincere moral judgments try and always fail to describe moral features of things. So they have to show that the categorical reasons do not exist and that morality is not objective. Okay. So, by the way, preview for the next chapter, chapter 21, is going to be 11 arguments against moral objectivity. And so we will be seeing some of those nihilistic arguments posed in that chapter, and we'll look at more rigorous formulations of that. Okay, So let's talk about expressivism again. And so you can see that on the first point, they agree with the error theorist. Actually, the first two claims, they agree with the error theorist, that there are A, no moral features in the world, and 2, that there are no true moral claims. So they agree there. However, unlike the error theorists, expressivists think that morality is not an error in our thinking, but that they reject the third feature, okay, that our sincere moral judgments try and always fail to describe moral features of things. So what the move that the expressivist makes is to say, no, that's not right. Instead, what we're doing when we're making moral judgments is we're not trying to describe the way the world is. We are trying to tell something about ourselves, about our own inner state, our feelings, our wishes, our desires. That's what we're doing when we make sincere moral judgments. Okay, so that's the key difference then between the error theorist and the expressivist. So they're not saying our sincere moral judgments are in error, but that they are describing something else other than something about the world. Okay, and what they say we are expressing are things like our emotions, so we're venting, or we are trying to command others to act in certain ways when we make a moral judgment, or we are trying to reveal plans of action that we either observe or that we intend. So, example here is lots of different ways to translate, and that's what the expressivist does. They translate or paraphrase a moral judgment into an expression by a subject. So the claim here on the slide, torture is immoral, they're saying that's what we're doing when we say torture is immoral, is that we're not actually describing torture. What we're doing is we're describing some inner state, maybe our feelings, like torture makes me queasy. Or we're saying, we're trying to tell someone what to do, like, don't torture. Or we are trying to say that I'm going to arrange my life so that torture is never a part of it. Okay? So that's a plan of action. And, you can make a request, or it can be a request, like, please stop torturing. If you're doing it, please stop. Okay? So all of those ways are of translating or paraphrasing the moral judgment, torture is immoral, would work for the expressivist. Okay. So notice how this sidesteps the whole question of whether the moral judgment is true or not, because truth does not apply here. Those kinds of claims, like don't torture or torture makes me queasy, are not claims that can be true or false. They either report a direct internal state, like I feel pain, that kind of thing, or they are a command, so it's a different kind of locution than a proposition that we're making about the world. So that's the difference, is that the error theorist, at least, you could say, takes moral judgment at face value as being a claim grounded in something or a report about the world. It's trying to describe something about the world, okay? And therefore it can be true or false. But the expressivist makes this move to translate the moral judgment into something else that is neither true nor false, okay? I think your author does a fantastic job of explaining this. And so pages 314, 316, have a look there. Okay, so let's take a look, since I raised it last time, about expressivism and subjectivism. And so expressivism manages to avoid some of the problems that face subjectivism, as I alluded to last time, is that it avoids the problem of contradiction, because if moral claims cannot be true, they can't contradict each other. And so that's really convenient. Another problem that expressivism manages to avoid is that it can explain genuine moral disagreements as a class of emotions or personal opinions. Let's just take the torture example. Okay, you have one individual in the room who says torture is immoral, and then you have another person in the room who says torture is sometimes morally permissible. So if you have two positions, one makes this exclusive claim that torture is always immoral, just make that clear, and the other person says no, torture is sometimes immoral. What the expressivist is doing is saying, okay, so that actually isn't a moral disagreement. Instead, what that is two people who have different feelings. One person is saying, if we're just keeping it feelings, is that torture makes me queasy, and the other person is saying torture is maybe not the most pleasant thing, but it doesn't make me queasy. They're saying something about their feelings, their emotions. Okay, so again, that's what happens then to moral disagreement, is it gets translated as sort of competing preferences and tastes, personal tastes. Okay, so your next section in the text then is an attempt. And I was trying to think about how to characterize this for you. And I think one thing your author is doing here is trying to underscore the nature of argumentation and the importance of argumentation, of laws of logic in our moral reasoning. So it's a bit of a flashback to the introduction, pages 9 through 15, where he's carefully stepping you through the basics of logic, especially of deductive logic, and to show that, or at least to prepare you to encounter moral theories where the principles, the standards, or the rules that are argued for as with categorical reasons are based, can be established by sound reasoning or challenged by sound reasoning. And so that we have this common tool, whether we are defending a particular moral theory or objecting to a moral theory, that we have this common toolkit that moral reasoning obeys, just as any other kind of reasoning, about scientific reasoning, for example. And so the problem here is that logic is the benefit, of being able to express claims in the form of arguments, is that good argumentation, in other words, well-formed arguments, are truth-preserving, and meaning that if you produce or adduce true premises, and the conclusion is follows structurally from those premises, is established by or supported by those premises, then you know that the conclusion is true. That's what it means to be truth-preserving. So if you accept the premises in an argument, then in a deductive argument, then you have to accept the conclusion if the premises are true. And your author gives you a reminder of this and some examples. And so formally, at least, moral arguments are going to look a lot like other kinds of philosophical arguments, maybe about abstract things rather than states of affairs in the world. And so formally, they're going to look the same, and it would seem that they can be evaluated the same way, that you can agree with the conclusion or find the conclusion sound if the premises are sound, for example. Okay, so the expressivist, though, can't do that. The expressivist has to say that logic does not apply, that moral reasoning really cannot be done. And the way they say, the reason they can say that is because they have made that move back here, number 3, that moral judgments are not actually descriptions of anything in the world. They are instead reports of something internal to the subject. Okay? So that's why logic will break down for the expressivists. So, I mean, if you look at something like the claim that your author makes in 316 as part of a moral argument. So take this claim. All actions that dehumanize people are immoral. Okay? I mean, you can, of course, substitute whatever general moral principle you want to in there. You could say something like, all actions that discriminate against people based on race are immoral. You could put that in there. Okay? What the premise would really mean for the expressivist is here that dehumanizing people, oh, I really don't like that. Or please do not dehumanize people. Or we would say, taking my other example, we would say, discriminating on the basis of race, that's like old-fashioned, and we don't do that anymore. That's really unpleasant. Or we would say, let's arrange a society where that just doesn't happen. I don't want to be part of a society where racial discrimination is acceptable. Okay, so all of those are paraphrases of that first premise. So notice that in a world of objective moral standards, the first premise is saying something about the world. Okay? All right. So I think I said enough about that. But what happens then by paraphrasing that first claim, the general moral principle there, into something other than a claim about the world is that you no longer have the possibility of a sound argument. Okay? So the validity breaks down. You can't even have a valid moral argument if expressivism is true. Okay. Let's see, what else? Oh yes, amoralists. So, let's see, how do I want to put it? Yeah, so if you want to read more about the amoralists, where you want to go is the discussion of Hobbes' Fool in chapter 14. This is on pages 206 through 210. And we're going to see the amoralists pop up in our next chapter, where we look at 11 arguments against objective morality. So if you want to read more about the amoralist, I highly recommend looking at pages 206 and 210 and reading about Hobbes' Fool. Okay, so what do we need to take away from this? Okay, so we've already said that expressivism is when we make moral judgments, they're expressing our feelings. And it's those feelings that motivate us then to act. But the amoralist is someone who makes moral judgments but is not motivated to act by them. Let me see here. Yeah, so the expressivist has to say that the amoralist is impossible, and that seems to be contrary to basic observations that we can make. So let's say that can you think of somebody? I'll just use his example, and you can fill it in with your own example, maybe from your own experience here, is that someone can sincerely believe that charity is admirable, okay? But when asked or when thinking about their own opportunity to be charitable, to give out their own money, to make their own contribution, they are just indifferent about it. They have no moral qualm. Their conscience doesn't bother them. Okay, so that's the amoralist. Someone who would say, sure, charity is admirable, but I feel no compulsion to abide by that. Okay, that's the amoralist. So it'd be very strange, for example, about when it comes to duties in particular, like life or death duties, it'd be very strange for a firefighter, say, who, as part of their conviction, their commitment, really, to their way of life, agrees with the idea that, yeah, I need to, it's my duty to risk death, and to, at times, it's my duty to risk death to try and rescue people out of a fire. Okay? It would be strange for that individual to then say, I'm not motivated to do that. Okay? But that would be, the expressivist has to say that can't be possible. But, there's plenty of evidence to show that that is not impossible. So it may be unusual, but it's not unheard of. There's plenty of people in high stress positions, soldiers, who can become bitter or cynical over time, and who maybe intellectually agree with the moral judgment that, hey, it's my duty to take care of my buddy, to be the wingman, right? But then reach a point where they just don't feel the motivation to do that anymore. Doesn't seem impossible, but the expressivist has to deny that the amoralist exists. So, I don't think I have anything more to say about that. It's a short section. So here is the fun part, and this is the last section in the chapter, is that the tricky cases for expressivism. And what the expressivist is up against here is the paraphrase problem. Some moral judgments, sure, it's easy to figure out how you translate those into expressions of personal taste or feelings or wishes or commands. Yeah, we looked at those. Torture is immoral, for example. But your author gives you a few examples of ones that where the meaning seems to be transparent, but the expressivist is going to have to do some serious mental gymnastics to translate it into emotional expressions. So nobody but Jeff knows how to behave when the boss is around. This seems to be, citing something that is not an expression by an individual's emotions at all, but an observation about Jeff's behavior, and that it is morally praiseworthy, for example. Well, at least prudentially praiseworthy, right? So it seems to be a pretty obvious kind of claim, and it's understandable. So how do you reword this as a command or as an emotional expression or plan? Not clear how you would do that. And something like that is the sort of thing where if somebody says it, it's not obvious that you have to question their motives or trustworthiness when they make that kind of statement. Another one. Here, another moral judgment that's made that isn't clear how you make this as a claim about feelings. I'm not sure whether torture is ever acceptable, but I'm sure that some who are wiser than I have the correct answer. Okay, so that's expressing some sort of self-awareness of moral fallibility, for example, and that one can understand moral arguments both for and against torture, and an expression of, and there is an expression that there exist those who are wiser, maybe have more knowledge about the facts of torture and the consequences of torture, the sort of reliability questions, psychology, and all of that that would be relevant, that they would have a better judgment than this individual is expressing here. Okay, so this is an expression of moral fallibility, but it doesn't necessarily express an emotional reaction, even though it is sort of a moral judgment of oneself, right? Okay, here's another one. There's a difference between an action's being required, morally good, virtuous, deserving of praise. So yeah, here we're talking about, it seems to be obvious that all of those distinctions are more than just verbal distinctions, that they are describing facts about people, facts about their actions, facts about consequences of actions, facts about consequences of character. So, that too, then, to deny the distinctions there are real distinctions is what the expressivists would have to do, and it's not clear, and then to paraphrase it as some sort of emotional answer or emotional claim, rather than a claim about these differences being actual in the world. That seems to be kind of transparent. That's a claim about differences one can observe. Okay, so I've got the other one in here too. Some actions fulfill moral duties and yet lack moral worth. Okay, so you can consider that one as, think of some moral duties like truth-telling, and you can think of an example of that where there's a famous Kantian example where if there's a imperative that you have the duty to never lie, or lying is always wrong, and you have, the example is you have killers who come to your door and you are hiding someone who is innocent and is trying to escape these killers, and the killers ask you, is the dude here? And if you lie, then you're violating that moral duty. And so most people feel that, well, yeah, in that case you would lie. So you could fulfill a moral duty on a Kantian theory and say, okay, no, the duty is categorical. There are categorical reasons to never lie. And so you tell the truth to the killers. It would be reasonable to say then that action lacks moral worth, okay, because it ends in some wrong being done to an innocent person. Okay, so that would be an example to sort of fill in what that claim is saying. And again, the moral judgment here is the observation about the difference between duties and worth, moral duties and moral worth. That seems to be kind of transparent, that you can make that distinction and that it's a real distinction. And the Kantian example is just a way to illustrate that. Okay, we are done. I cannot keep these things under 45 minutes. What is my deal? I'm sorry I blab so much about this, but I do want to make sure that that the material is helpful to you. And this is fun stuff. Metaethics is fun stuff. So if you have any questions, by all means get in touch with me. Drop me a comment, in the video. Email me, however you want to get in contact, and I'd be glad to clear anything up that was unclear in this presentation, or if you have further questions, be glad to answer them. But until then, I'll talk to you later.